Hello, everyone, and welcome back to episode of the Biblionaut, or also known as a guy who likes to talk about books. I uh, I was thinking the other day, the last broadcast I did, I talked a little bit about recommendations, and the two that I pulled off were really just a couple of things I pulled off random off my shelves that were a couple of my favorites. But I started thinking about recommendations in general. And recommending books to other people is a little bit of a fool's game, I think, because it really depends on what it is you're looking for in your reading. You know, if you're looking for enjoyment, entertainment, to kill some time, then I don't think I can really necessarily. There's just too many different kinds of books. You know, you might like murder mysteries, you might like science fiction, you might like westerns, and or there's just no telling. There's all kinds of different types of books out there uh, for entertainment purposes. Uh, and that's not to say that that the classics aren't for entertainment too. It just depends though if you are just looking to a wide range of reading and you're not really don't really have a goal in mind. If you do have a goal in mind, I guess it's best to kind of think about what it is that you're trying to achieve. If there's a particular kind of book that you are hoping to run across, or maybe you're just interested in becoming more fluent in literature. And if that's the case, then I think somebody could maybe perhaps recommend some books to at least get somebody started, especially if they're starting from ground zero. There's a lot of list books out there right now, books lists of books. One of the more popular ones is the book 1001 Books You Must Read Before You Die. It has a list of all these novels that a person, I don't know what their criteria is, but for some reason or other they pick these as being significant books that people ought to read. Uh, I don't I don't personally don't believe in that. I don't believe there are any books that you must read before you die. I think that a person on their reading journey, they usually one book leads itself to another, or a conversation about books might lead to other books. But it really what you must read. I don't know how you can justify something like that. I would say that there are books that might be worthwhile to you, and the thing of it is too is that what's worthwhile to you today may not be worthwhile to you in 10 years. That's people grow, they change, and so sometimes books grow with the person, and sometimes they don't. So I read a ton of Edgar Rice Burroughs books when I was in my early teenage years, and for those of you who may not know, Edgar Rice Burroughs wrote the Tarzan books along with many, many other adventure type books. And I just read a ton of those kind of books because that was what appealed to me. That's what I liked. I liked a very straightforward hero saves the day kind of story. And I wouldn't have had patience for much beyond that. And I had to grow, mature. I had to change, and those books I still have a fondness for them, but I don't usually read those very much because I've passed that stage, I guess. So at any rate, the point is that for every person, they're going to have some books that are going to be relevant to them. The only thing I think that a list of books might help somebody is if they have a particular goal. Perhaps maybe you want to feel like you are more literate or culturally literate. Not like you read better, but as in that you can have a conversation about literature with other people that might share the same kind of backgrounds that you have, and you would have things to talk about. So there are probably a few books that might indicate um, the, the, there are a few books that many people have read, I guess, is what I'm trying to get at. And that way it would give you a large basis for conversation about literature in general. So just taking to start with American literature, because every nationality and group has a history of literature. But if just say, for instance, that you wanted to concentrate on American literature, you say, I would like to know more or be more conversant with American literature. All right. in my mind, American literature really just starts with Nathaniel Hawthorne. That's the main um, first really truly successful and probably worthwhile author that America produced. There were others, non, you have Benjamin Franklin, so I mean, it's not like there aren't others, but it's just from a purely literary point of view, probably Hawthorne is probably a good starting point. And a lot of people may have been introduced to Hawthorne in high school because the Scarlet Letter is a pretty standard text for American high schoolers. And you may have read that. And if you have, um, some people, it's a little bit different. The language is a little bit different, and the pace is different. And some people are just not going to enjoy that kind of thing as much as when it was first written. But I do feel like that would be a decent starting point. If you had absolutely no idea where to start and you wanted to start at a good example of early American literature, I think that probably Nathaniel Hawthorne is probably going to be your most accessible, your most entertaining, and one of your most easiest to find books, because there's probably a ton of Scarlet Letter books out there at thrift shops, used bookstores, Barnes and Noble, wherever you go, you're going to be able to find that book because it is still such a part of the syllabus of American high schools. You may not want to devote that much time to Hawthorne. You may begin reading it and you don't like it. Then you may just try to read a couple of his short stories. He wrote many short stories as well. The Scarlet Letter is his most famous novel. The House of Seven Gables is also another one. One of his most famous short stories is called Young Goodman Brown, and that's another book, another story that's often discussed in high school situations. So if you don't want to read the novel, maybe just try to read the story, and that gives you a little bit of a taste of what Hawthorne's writing is like. It might give you an idea whether that's something you want to pursue or not. Moving forward from Hawthorne, you kind of think about some of the historical events that were happening. Okay, so of course Hawthorne is writing in the 1830s, 40s, maybe the 50s. I can't remember exactly, but in that first quarter to half century of the 19th century, and this is pre-Civil War. Okay, so at that time, much of American literature was kind of concentrated on realism, what it was like, what it was really like in the United States, and also there were with the looming Civil War, there were many books also that touched on slavery as a subject, and the most famous of those obviously is Uncle Tom's Cabin. Um, Uncle Tom's Cabin is important as an historical artifact, I believe, but it's a very melodramatic piece of writing, and as purely as literature, well, I won't say that it's not good. I just say that it's a little different. It's meant to convey a point of view, and it's meant to convince people of a certain point of view, which was an abolitionist point of view, and to show some of the horrors of slavery. And so, very worthwhile, but it may not be, as I said, it may not be the highest literary mark that American literature produced at that time. If you're looking for very, let's say, worthwhile or edifying maybe literature, I would say at that same time you have Melville, who was writing. And obviously Melville's main book, Moby Dick, which I recommend that I wouldn't say that's a must read, but I think that if you are going to be conversant with American literature, that it's about as close as it can be to a must read. A lot of people don't like Moby Dick because it's very discursive. He goes off into tangents. He talks about what it's like to actually the whaling process, how they actually killed the whale, they stripped the blubber, and I mean it goes on and on into much detail. I just tried reading that at one point in my life, and I had a really hard time with it. I got caught up in all the minutia that went into this whaling process, and I got bored. And I think that if you're going to approach Moby Dick, the thing of it is to remember it's the journey. It's not the destination. The plot does move forward. It moves kind of slowly and jerks because there might be a chapter or two that deal with the plot, and then there might be a chapter or two that deal with this whaling process. But if you kind of approach this in like as each chapter is kind of an essay, these chapters that dealt with the whaling process, you will find do not just deal with the whaling process. They might be technical, but they also illustrate some other deeper meanings. And but anyway, the book as a whole, I'm not going to say that it's perfect, but I do think that it is excellent. I really enjoyed it when I read it here not that long ago. But that is a serious commitment. Somebody who wants to read Moby Dick, you might read some of Melville's shorter works and get some benefit from those. I, you know, the name escapes me. Well, Billy Budd is another one of his shorter novels. That's another one. I haven't read that, but I know it's well regarded. And Bartleby the Scrivener, that's what I was trying to think of, is a short story that is also discussed in high schools quite a bit. I remember doing it in my high school. And those might be some in case you didn't want to just launch off into Moby Dick, which I don't really necessarily blame someone. It is a commitment. It would take you a little while to get through that. But I don't think that you can really replace Melville's best work with his shorter works. They are different. Once you move past Melville, I think that you'd have to look at Samuel L. Clemens, Mark Twain, and specifically Huckleberry Finn. I think that I am not necessarily a big fan of Huckleberry Finn, but again, if you want to be culturally literate, if you want to be able to be conversant about American literature, I don't think that you can skip Huckleberry Finn. I think you have to read it, and you have to be able to see what Twain was trying to do there. And and just because I say that it's not one of my favorites, that has nothing to do. I mean, it's many people love Huckleberry Finn, so that's why, and that's one of the reasons why I think that recommended books sometimes is a fool's game, because here I am, I don't really like Huckleberry Finn, like I'm some kind of a snob, but really, many people love it. So I think that that's something that you read it. If you don't like it, then put it aside and go for something else. There's some other Twain books that I think probably obviously Tom Sawyer is very popular. Tom Sawyer is more of I would say a young adult book. Huckleberry Finn can kind of read that way a little bit too at times, but at least the first 3/4 of Huckleberry Finn is very worthwhile. The ending's a little strange, but at any rate, again, to be culturally literate, I think that's a book that you need to read. After Twain, I think that Poe is your next mandatory read if you're going to be fluent in American literature. And Poe's a little bit easier, or at least it's not quite the investment, because he mostly wrote short stories. The Telltale Heart was one of my favorite. The Fall of the House of Usher, Murders in the Rue Morgue. Poe was an innovator, and many of the things that we have, many of the styles that we have today, the modern detective story, the way horror stories are written, Poe was a huge influence on all that. So a lot of the people who are writing today, you can trace back to Edgar Allan Poe. And I think also with Poe, I think it not only, if I were going to suggest just two stories, probably Murders in the Rue Morgue, just because of its influence on the detective genre, and then the other would be The Raven, the poem The Raven, and I think that would give you an idea, and hopefully you would read those and go on and maybe read another. Poe's books are very easy to find. Usually they're headed under a title, Tales of Mystery and Imagination. That's a very popular title for his stories, and they generally contain the top 10 or so stories of it, plus The Raven usually. And easy to find, very accessible, and very very worthwhile. Once you get past Poe and you start looking at the turn of the century, Americans at that time then were involved in, you had the expansion west, and also back east, you had the rise of these huge conglomerations, these huge businesses, and so then at that time you also had people who were starting to question, um, some like Standard Oil or some of the big railroad industries. They were starting to question this unregulated capitalism. And you may remember from your history lessons about Teddy Roosevelt being the trust buster and trying to break a lot of these monopolies up. One of the books in my mind that illustrates this pretty well is called The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. It was kind of an expose on the meatpacking industry in Chicago, and it opened up a lot of people's eyes as to what happens when you have completely unregulated capitalism. You know, I'm all for capitalism, but I also am for some sensible regulations, and this kind of would show you why. Moving past that area, the next big event probably was World War One in American history, world history, but American history as well. And the returning veterans from that time, they had some comments about their experiences, either both in the war and what they found in America afterwards. And for that period, say the late 20s to the 30s, I think there are two books probably that one could choose if one wanted to get a flavor of that time period. The first being The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald, and the second being The Sun Also Rises by Hemingway. And both of them are fine books. I like The Sun Also Rises a bit better, but both of those are two that are taught in high schools as well. You may have already run into those. And but those are some heavyweights in American literature. Moving past the 20s and the 30s, before World War II, I think that it's also important to try to become acquainted with Faulkner. And Faulkner he's a difficult writer. Many of his books are very difficult. Some are almost impenetrable. And it will take some patience to get through. I think probably the Light in August is maybe one of the most accessible of his, one of them, and that would certainly be a place to start, or maybe some of his short stories. Once World War II happened and the returning veterans from World War II came back, a lot of American literature started slipping into more satire. Satire being a way of highlighting problems within the society by either overemphasizing them or making them sort of ridiculous. And first off, when you think about that kind of period, I one of the first people that pops into my mind is Joseph Heller with Catch-22, who basically satirized the U.S. Army during World War II. And I think, one of the biggest things you might take away from a novel like that is that there was a story that was put out for the public, and then there was a story that was lived by the men who actually fought the war. And I think that many veterans, when they came back, they had a hard time handling that there were two different stories. There was one way that they were seen, and there was what the reality was that they knew. And that was, I'm not going to say it was difficult for them. I'm just going to say that kind of raised some eyebrows. And I think Joseph Heller kind of explored that a little bit in Catch-22. Another good satire at the time, I think, is a little bit later than that, but is One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest by Ken Kesey. Kesey worked in a mental institution, and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest is a kind of in a way, sort of an expose, a treatment of how people were treated in insane asylums and mental institutions at the time. And also, I think it probably deals with a lot more than just that. I'll leave it at that. I'll leave it for you to explore. But those are those kind of cover a little bit of the satire era. Well, it's not that satire era has ended. I think it's continued, and I actually think that's a detriment, but that's beside the point. Once you started getting past the 1960s up until the 1980s or so, American literature started to fragment. Prior to that, it was sort of it was kind of, I won't say it was controlled, but I guess you might say that white men were the ones who had the most success at that period, and with the rise of identity politics in the late 60s, 70s or so, many other groups that had felt disenfranchised or didn't feel like they had a voice became more prominent. And so different ethnicities, different sexual identities, what have you, these groups started claiming a louder voice and came a little bit more to the forefront. They wanted to have their story told. They felt like the stories that had been told in literature before did not represent them. I think maybe one of the better books maybe to look at if you are interested in that side of the story. And I think, like I said, if you want to be conversant with all American literature, it's good to push your boundaries. Beloved by Toni Morrison is probably a book that many people have read, and if you are going to be conversant about that sort of thing, I think it would give you a chance to be able to put your 2 cents in with by actually having read some things that are maybe outside of your own experience. I don't know who I'm talking to, so I mean it might be Beloved might be exactly represent some of your experiences, but for myself it was definitely outside of my experience. So just very briefly, Beloved is a story of an escaped slave who made her way over the border into, I believe it was Indiana. I can't remember exactly, one of the northern states, and was pursued and was about to be taken back to the slave state, and was so concerned about this that she actually decided to kill her own daughter so that her daughter would not have to go back. That was the absolute horror that she felt about going back to this situation. And so it's a very powerful book. I'm not going to say that it's one of my favorites either. There are some things that I didn't necessarily care for in the book, but I do think it's important to, just as far as getting other people's point of view. Once you pass that period, you start looking at the turn of the century. You start looking at perhaps David Foster Wallace, although his largest book, Infinite Jest, is a very, very, very long book. It's quite the endeavor. Thomas Pynchon is very popular. He also writes some very long books. I think that once you get past Beloved and once you get into the 20th century, it does seem to me like American literature further fragments into different groups and who are trying to tell their story. And many of these first-time novelists are very autobiographical. In other words, instead of trying to maybe relate the American experience, they are trying to illustrate their version of an American experience. And so I resist kind of trying to recommend anything from the last 20 years or so, because it's hard to tell which of those will actually hold water, which of them will actually still be around in another 20 or 30 years. Recently I did read that one of the some magazine or some website had voted and had decided that so far, was a very limited sample group, that so far the best American novel of the 20th century had been The Brief and Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde by Junot Diaz. And I did read that, and again, I think that that is a book that tells a particular slice of the American experience. In this case, the Dominican Republic suffered under a cruel dictator for many, many years, and there was what they call the Dominican diaspora, where many Dominicans came to America and restarted their lives. And this brief and wondrous life of Oscar Wilde illustrates some of that. So you have a section, a slice. So to me, it's very rare to come across, and I'm not saying that they're not out there, but it's rare to come across books that try to define the American experience, or like Melville, when you go back all the way back to the 1850s, who was trying to um, describe an experience, a transcendental experience, something that is above just your human experiences here on Earth. And maybe that's not. It doesn't mean it's a religious thing. It just means that a inquiry into the nature of the world. How we live in the world, how we react. How our uh, what it means to be human. Those kind of things. So that's just a very brief overview. I don't remember exactly how many books I mentioned in this, 10 or so, but I think that if you were to read either the ones that I suggested, or perhaps even maybe a shorter work by the ones that I suggested, that would be a very solid basis for branching out on your own afterwards and finding out other things that you are interested in. Okay, well, I still went over my time limit a little bit, but I'm going to stop there for now, and I'll try to do another episode soon. All right, thanks for listening. If you like what I'm talking about, leave a comment, subscribe, and if there's a particular subject you'd like for me to talk about, then I definitely would, just like I said, leave a comment, and I'll definitely talk about whatever you like, because obviously I like talking about books.